You are not fragile. You are dangerous. You just don't realize it yet. Carl Jung knew once the empath awakens, there is no going back. And this awakening is the most disturbing transformation in human psychology, the integration of the shadow. Here, you won't hear any nice self-help phrases. Here you will hear the truth that the world tries to hide, that your sensitivity is a weapon, that your pain is a map, that your consciousness is power. Follow the channel now, because each video here is a surgical cut into your soul. You will stop being manipulated. You will see what no one admits. You will learn to use your shadow as strength, and you will discover what it means to love without betraying yourself. If this scares you, it's because it's already started tearing you apart inside. And this is just the first step of awakening. There comes a moment when you stop deceiving yourself. A moment that doesn't warn, doesn't ask for permission, just tears. It's what Carl Jung saw as the shock of conscience. The point at which the soul can no longer bear being a prisoner of the persona. You spend years serving as a repository for the pain of others, carrying the weight of parents, partners, friends, believing this was spirituality, that this was kindness. But it wasn't. It was disguised submission. You smiled as you swallowed humiliations. You kept quiet when you were betrayed. You shut yourself out believing you were light, until something inside you snapped. It's not a nervous breakdown. It's the shadow screaming that enough is enough. It's the self demanding to be born. It's consciousness spitting out every lie you've accepted. And when that snap happens, there's no going back. You never look at the world the same way again. This slap is brutal. It's as if life is throwing a secret dossier of all the times you betrayed yourself in your face. Remember that relationship where you begged for love when deep down you knew it was manipulation? Remember the boss who stole your idea and you pretended not to care? Remember every time you laughed while bleeding inside? The slap returns all of this in seconds, and the pain is searing because you realize you always knew. You always saw the signs, but chose to ignore them to maintain the illusion. This shock is a betrayal of yourself. It's your conscience showing you that your spineless spirituality has become a shackle. You weren't a victim. You were complicit in your own annihilation. And it's precisely this confrontation that burns. It's not the world against you. It's you against the lie you yourself upheld. And here lies the wound few can bear to look at. The snap doesn't destroy you. It rips off your mask. The persona falls away, and you see, naked and raw, what you tried to hide, your fury, your strength, your repressed intelligence. The shadow presents itself, and you discover it was never your enemy. It is your weapon. It is the one that will restore your limits. It is the one that will turn your sensitivity into a razor. From that moment on, you are no longer just an empath. You are dynamite. Anyone who dares manipulate you will feel it. The snap is the opening of the cage. You are not docile. You were never fragile. You were conditioned to believe this, and now as the silence explodes, there is no going back to who you were, because the first cut has already been made, and the open wound only points to something even more devastating, realizing that your snap is merely the prelude to what comes next, the revelation that you never carried just your pain, but the entire shadow of your family, your history, your society. You've always been the place where others poured their shadows. Carl Jung described the empath as one who carries not only their own pain, but also the collective pain. You grew up believing your role was to absorb the weight of your family, to bear your mother's silent screams, your father's silent rage, the chaos of friends who only sought you out to vent. It was never a coincidence. You became everyone's emotional buffer, and it cost them dearly. Because while they vomited their frustrations, you remained silent so as not to hurt. While they betrayed your trust, you sought excuses to defend them. You turned your spirituality into a prison, calling compassion what was, in truth, servitude. With each insult swallowed, your consciousness bent a little further until you believed that this was your identity. You weren't a son, a partner, a friend. You were a repository. And those who get used to being a repository forget they can say enough. These roles weren't chosen by you, they were imposed. Your family's shadow needed a scapegoat, and you accepted this burden without realizing it. How many times have you defended an abusive father, saying he was just nervous? How many times have you justified someone's betrayal, believing that true love meant enduring the unbearable? How many times have you smiled to hide your tears because you believed being strong meant not bothering? You did what every empath does, internalized the dysfunction and called it loyalty. But loyalty without awareness is self-annihilation. And here's the truth. It wasn't kindness. It was fear of abandonment. It was the persona convincing you that if you were useful, you wouldn't be rejected. But the self within you knew this was a lie. Because the more you nullified yourself, the more people abused you. And your body learned the language of silence, insomnia, gastritis, anxiety, unexplained breakdowns. What you called love was just survival. You became an expert at carrying other people's burdens, but you never learned to carry your own. And that's how your spirituality became contaminated, because compassion isn't about being a trash can. Carl Jung said that where the shadow is denied, it takes hold, and the shadows of others found a comfortable refuge in you. The result? You lost yourself. You began to believe you were weak, when in fact you were too strong for enduring what you never should have endured. You mistook patience for passivity, confused love for slavery. And every time someone heaped their guilt and fears on you, your conscience screamed, but you silenced it, until the accumulation became unbearable. And if at the first moment you discovered there was no more room for lies, now you realize there's also no more room for carrying burdens that aren't yours. Because every buffer has a limit, and your limit is the beginning of the war for your own life. While the world believed you suffered in silence, in reality, you were constructing maps. Carl Jung observed this in empathic patients. They weren't victim diaries, but veritable psychic war rooms. Every lie they heard was recorded, every manipulation catalogued, every shadow identified with surgical precision. You always knew more than you let on, seemingly fragile, but internally calculating. While others spoke, you read micro-expressions. While they hurt you, you learned their patterns. It was as if your consciousness had created an invisible chessboard on which each of their moves was silently recorded. And this arsenal wasn't built for revenge, but for clarity. To prove that your sensitivity was never weakness, but method. You didn't cry because you lacked strength. You cried because you already knew too much and couldn't say it. The awakened empath's mind is a dark room, full of reports, memories, details no one else bothered to keep. You remember the way someone looked away when lying, the altered tone of voice when hiding something, the charged silence after a betrayal. These are invisible records, but they live within you. Carl Jung said that the shadow reveals itself in the smallest gestures, and you've written them all down, even without meaning to. This data collection is instinctive, and that's why society fears awakened empaths, because you see what no one else admits. Transformed consciousness isn't magic, it's observation. When someone lies to you, you don't just feel it, you know it. You could write entire books about every person who has ever deceived you because your emotional memory is a library. And like any library, it doesn't burn down on its own. One day the doors will open. What others call intuition for you has always been processing. You don't guess, you analyze. You don't dream, you record. That's why manipulators fear you without understanding why. Because you possess a conscience that works like radar. Every poorly told lie, every poorly rehearsed excuse, every hidden shadow, everything passes through this filter. And the more you awaken, the clearer this ability becomes. Imagine using this perception in your practical life. In work negotiations, you'll know who's lying. In relationships, you'll spot signs of disloyalty before they explode. In family, you'll know the difference between love and manipulation. This is the war room of consciousness, an internal space where you've unwittingly accumulated ammunition for years. And when betrayal arrives, because it always does, it's no surprise. It's merely the trigger that transforms all this information into devastating clarity. Betrayal is always the trigger. No matter who you are, no matter how much you've resisted, it's the one that breaks the final thread. Carl Jung knew that individuation never happens without confrontation, and for the empath, that confrontation almost always comes from the most unlikely place, those you love most. It's not the enemy that hurts the deepest, but the ally you trusted blindly. The partner you protected who, in the shadows, stabbed you. The friend you defended who silently undermined your trust. The relative who swore love and turned your loyalty into a bargaining chip. The empath can endure everything except the betrayal of someone who swore care. And when it comes, it's not just pain. It's the brutal revelation that you saw the signs all along. You remember the averted glance, the flimsy excuses, the details your conscience caught, but your persona refused to believe. Betrayal is the portal that shows you what you always knew, but chose to ignore. And now, facing the abyss, there's no escape. Betrayal is a double wound. First, the act itself, the infidelity, the lie, the scam, the manipulation. But what truly shatters is the second wound, the realization that you always knew, that every detail was recorded in your war room of consciousness. You knew that hidden message wasn't innocent. You knew that prolonged silence hid something greater. You knew that "I love you" was tainted by shadows. And yet you chose to believe the best. This is the tragedy of the empath, loving so much that you choose to deny your own perception. But when betrayal explodes, your conscience no longer allows for excuses. You realize that you weren't just betrayed by the other, you were betrayed by yourself, for ignoring the voice of the self that was already screaming. This realization is devastating because it shatters the myth of naivete. You were never naive. You were complicit in your own blindness. And it is precisely this revelation that opens the portal. The portal of betrayal is not just a gateway to pain, it is a passage to transformation. Once you cross it, there is no turning back. Carl Jung described this process as shadow integration under extreme pressure. The shadow, once silenced, now rises, demanding a place, and what seemed only anger reveals itself as intelligence. What seemed only fragility reveals itself as power. What seemed only pain reveals itself as clarity. Betrayal is not the end, it is a rite of passage. After it, the empath can no longer be the same. What was once submission becomes a limit. What was once excuse becomes decision. What was once servitude becomes sovereignty. You discover that love does not mean allowing yourself to be destroyed. You discover that spirituality does not mean accepting the unacceptable. You discover that consciousness is more important than harmony. And when you cross this portal, you are no longer a victim. You are a different being. You are someone who has finally learned to trust what you see, what you feel, what you have always known. And this is just the beginning of the brutal awakening to come. Most expect you to break down in the face of betrayal. They expect crying, screaming outbursts. They expect drama. The betrayer prepares for chaos, anticipating tears, accusations, demands for explanations. But what they receive is something infinitely more devastating: silence. Not the silence of one who accepts, but the silence of one who has finally seen everything. Jung described this phenomenon as one of the most disturbing moments in the human psyche, when the awakened empath integrates their shadow and their awareness becomes surgical. The calm that emerges in this moment is not the absence of pain, but the absolute presence of clarity. And clarity is the most feared weapon. Because when you stop struggling and just look, the other knows they have been exposed. This calm has the power of a hidden earthquake. It dismantles disguises, dissolves masks, exposes intentions. And in that moment, you don't need to scream. The atmosphere itself screams for you. This calm fury is the point at which your sensitivity merges with the precision of the shadow. You don't react with desperation, you reveal. One by one, the facts emerge with the coldness of a scalpel. Every lie remembered, every contradiction exposed, every signal registered in your internal war room. The abuser doesn't understand how you know so much. But you didn't guess anything. You observed everything. Years of silence become an open archive, and the power to reveal without losing tone is what terrifies. Jung noted in his case histories that these empaths didn't seek revenge, only clarity. And clarity is more destructive than any scream. Because the manipulator doesn't fear being hated, they fear being exposed. And the moment you speak calmly, describing every detail, every shadow, the other doesn't just face you, they face their own conscience. That's why calm is fury. That's why silence is more piercing than 1,000 screams. And when this calm arrives, you realize you no longer need to beg for respect. Your very presence becomes a boundary. You understand, as Jung wrote, that the shadow is not just darkness, it is repressed intelligence. And when integrated, it doesn't transform you into a monster, but into a whole being. The calm fury of awakening is when you realize there is nothing to prove, nothing to dispute. You don't need to convince anyone of what you saw. You simply know. And knowing is absolute power. From that moment on, your relationships change. What was once submission becomes selection. What was once seeking becomes filtering. You remain empathetic, but now selective. You remain capable of love, but now with a backbone. Calm doesn't mean you've given up. It means you've awakened. And from that moment on, every step, every gesture, every choice becomes a sign that you are no longer a victim. You are consciousness itself incarnate. And that, for those who tried to manipulate you, is the ultimate nightmare. Carl Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but rather by facing their own shadow. For the empath, this is the most brutal point of the journey, discovering that what they always tried to deny is, in fact, the source of their strength. For years, you believed that anger was a sin, that saying no was selfish, that imposing limits was a lack of love. You pushed each of these truths into the basement of your unconscious, convinced that spirituality was self-denial. But when betrayal tears at your flesh, the shadow surfaces, demanding recognition. And you realize your anger is not an enemy, it is a compass. Your pain is not weakness, it is alert. Your distrust is not paranoia, it is intelligence. Integrating the shadow means ceasing to deny yourself. It means ceasing to fight against parts that have always been there, clamoring for space. And in that moment, the awakened empath discovers something that frightens the world. Their sensitivity is a weapon, their pain is ammunition, their conscience is a blade. Shadow integration isn't easy, it's an inner war. It's the process in which the persona dies and the self finally takes the throne. You begin to see clearly the manipulations you once called love. You realize that constant guilt, that need to please, was just your family's shadow speaking to you. You understand that distorted spirituality, where kindness meant carrying everyone's burdens, was just a disguise to keep you domesticated. And suddenly awareness explodes. You can love and say no. You can be empathetic and ruthless. You can be spiritual and still set boundaries. This fusion of opposites is individuation, and that's why awakened empaths seem so threatening, because they no longer fit into boxes. They're neither saints nor monsters, they are whole, and the whole always frightens the fragmented. Integrating the shadow is ceasing to be a piece, it's becoming wholeness, and wholeness is always disturbing. The integrated shadow gives the empath a clarity few can tolerate. You no longer apologize for feeling too much. You no longer suppress yourself to maintain harmony. You no longer accept being manipulated just to maintain the connection. You discover that loving doesn't mean allowing destruction. You discover that spirituality doesn't mean being a slave to kindness. You discover that consciousness doesn't just mean seeing the beautiful, but also recognizing the rotten. And this change is permanent. There's no way to disintegrate the shadow. Once you look into its eyes and say, "I recognize you," it ceases to dominate you from the shadows and becomes part of your inner army. This is where true strength is born. Loving deeply without losing yourself, feeling everything without breaking, exposing without cruelty, cutting without anger. The integrated empath is no longer a victim, but neither is he an executioner. He is a presence that disarms, a consciousness that cuts, a spirituality with a backbone. And this is just the beginning of the next revelation. Love with limits. Love without boundaries is not love, it's servitude. Carl Jung said that where there is no conscience, what we call virtue may be just illness in disguise. The empath spent his life believing that love meant enduring everything, forgiving everything, justifying everything. That spirituality meant enduring betrayals, remaining silent in the face of injustice, and adopting the persona of the good guy so as not to disturb. But awakening reveals a brutal truth. Love without a backbone is self-annihilation. It's not about becoming cold or cruel, but about realizing that true love only exists when there are boundaries. Because boundaries are protection. They prevent your compassion from becoming currency for manipulation. They transform the shadow into an ally, reminding us that unfiltered care is just desperation for acceptance. Love with a backbone doesn't apologize for existing. It knows it doesn't need to bleed to prove its feelings. It doesn't need approval, because conscience is approval enough. This new love is selective, not because it has lost its essence, but because it has finally learned to honor it. The integrated empath doesn't open their soul to just anyone. They know how to read who deserves access and who deserves distance, and this selection is frightening, because the manipulator, accustomed to feeding on naive generosity, senses something has changed. The same smile, but a different presence. The same look, but now an impenetrable filter. The awakened empath remains spiritual, but not just a facade, a conscious spiritual. They can offer the warmest hug and at the same time, the firmest refusal. They can say, "I love you," and right after say, "I'm not playing that game." And this fusion is terrifying for those accustomed to exploitation, because now you no longer negotiate your value. You no longer accept cheap love. You no longer offer explanations to protect those who hurt you. This is love with a backbone, tender yet relentless. What was once naivete is now discretion. What was once fear of loss is now the power to choose. The awakened empath understands that love without limits is self-betrayal. And when this awareness sets in, there is no turning back. You begin to say no without fear, to walk away without guilt, to protect yourself without remorse. And, paradoxically, it is at this point that your capacity to love becomes even greater, because now there is no hidden resentment, no accumulated anger, no suffocating expectation. There is only pure love, free from the need to sacrifice for acceptance. This is the self in action, loving fully and with discernment, spirituality as a sword, compassion as a wall. You remain a source of care, But now this care is sacred, non-negotiable. And the most disturbing thing is that this transformation is not announced in words. It is felt. Those who encounter you realize something has changed forever. And it is precisely this change that makes room for the next cut, the mirror that returns to the world its own shadow. The awakened empath doesn't need to raise their voice. Their mere presence is enough to expose what was hidden. Carl Jung said that the unconscious reveals itself through the other, and that's exactly what happens when you become a mirror. You don't accuse, you don't shout, you don't justify yourself, you simply exist. And that existence reflects. Manipulators, accustomed to operating in the shadows, suddenly find themselves naked before you. They feel uncomfortable, uneasy, as if every gesture were being watched by an invisible tribunal. But it's not external judgment. It's their own consciousness reacting to their new state. You no longer need to unmask anyone. The mere fact of being there forces them to see themselves. And this is the most devastating weapon. You have become a mirror that doesn't lie. Those who are truthful feel welcomed. Those who are false feel threatened. The awakened empath doesn't need to prove anything. They simply reveal unintentionally what the other was trying to hide from themselves. This effect is disturbing because it's silent. You don't confront, but the other person's entire life crumbles around you. The alcoholic relative can't stand your visits anymore because they realize they can't hide behind excuses. The manipulative colleague avoids conversation because they feel every false word will be seen through. The abusive partner, once comfortable in their power, becomes afraid without understanding why. This fear doesn't come from an explicit threat, but from the feeling of being seen. Jung called this projection, the other projects onto you what they can't bear to acknowledge in themselves. And now your mirror brutally returns it. You no longer have to carry the pain of others. You are no longer a buffer for the collective shadow. Now you are the clear surface that returns each shadow to its owner. And that changes everything, because when the mirror appears, the game is over. The manipulator flees. The authentic one approaches. Balance imposes itself. The empath's mirror is both a portal and a judgment. You become one who no longer allows masks, not because you want to expose yourself, but because you can no longer sustain lies. And the world reacts immediately. Healthy people feel safe in your presence because they know they don't have to pretend. Toxic people feel threatened because they know they can no longer manipulate. This distinction happens effortlessly, without intention. It's natural, it's inevitable. And that's what's so frightening. The integrated empath becomes a living detector of truth, a radar of consciousness. Your spirituality ceases to be merely welcoming and becomes discernment. You no longer absorb the shadows of others. You reflect them. And by reflecting, you force each person to see themselves as they truly are. This is the hidden function of the awakened empath, to be a light that doesn't adorn, but burns. And it is precisely this uncomfortable light that paves the way for the next stage, when this perception ceases to be merely defensive and transforms into a conscious strategy. When the awakened empath realizes the scope of their consciousness, something changes forever. They stop simply reacting and start building. Carl Jung said that individuation is not a final destination, but an ongoing process of self-creation. The integrated empath takes this to another level. They are no longer just someone who perceives patterns. They become a psychological architect, capable of shaping relationships, choices, and even entire environments based on their clarity. Imagine negotiating a contract. While others argue over numbers, you read intentions, perceive hidden fears, detect unspoken desires. Imagine choosing partners. While others delude themselves with masks, you see the self behind the persona. Imagine leading a group. While others manipulate with empty promises, you inspire because you speak directly to each person's shadow, and it recognizes the truth. This power is not learned from books, but conquered on the battlefield of one's own soul. And that is why the awakened empath is so frightening. This new awareness makes you a natural strategist. It's not manipulation, it's precision. It's not a mystical gift, it's clarity trained by pain. Jung observed that transformed empaths had a near-perfect accuracy rate in reading the unconscious minds of others. And when this skill is used intentionally, the results are devastating. You can predict disloyalty before it happens. You can spot emotional games before they form. You can spot lies in their first draft, and instead of getting lost in them, you use your perception to build. You create healthy relationships because you nip any seeds of manipulation in the bud. You grow in your career because you see beyond appearances and make strategic decisions. You organize your life with precision because you know exactly where to invest your energy. This is the difference. Before, your empathy was reactive. Now, it's architectural. You don't just feel the world. You redesign it from your consciousness. And the more you apply this skill, the clearer the awakened empath's role becomes, to be a silent guide in a blind world. Your spirituality ceases to be mere compassion and becomes direction. Your shadow ceases to be a burden and becomes a map. Your self ceases to be theory and becomes a living practice. You become a reference, not because you want to be followed, but because your simple way of being inspires. People realize that with you, there is no room for masks, but also no room for games. You create systems, networks, spaces of clarity. You become the psychological architect of your own life, and without realizing it, you also influence the lives of others. Not because you manipulate, but because you expose with your presence what works and what doesn't. This is the invisible architecture of consciousness. And it opens the final door of the journey, the inner revolution, where you finally understand that feeling everything is not a curse. It is the final step to becoming whole. There comes a moment when the awakened empath realizes that their journey was never about becoming someone different, but about becoming whole. Carl Jung called this individuation, the point at which the persona falls away, the shadow is integrated, and the self takes its rightful place. This is the ultimate inner revolution. You no longer fear feeling too much because you understand that your sensitivity is your greatest weapon. You no longer fear rejection because you know that those who cannot handle your truth do not deserve your space. You no longer fear loneliness because you have discovered that true companionship arises when you belong to yourself. This revolution does not happen with external explosions, but with a silent and definitive shift. Consciousness ceases to be hostage to others' expectations and becomes sovereign. You are no longer a victim, nor a martyr, nor a savior. You are someone who finally embodies the power of being whole. And this, for a world accustomed to exploiting your fragility, is terrifying. This revolution manifests itself in every detail of practical life. Relationships cease to be prisons and become choices. Work ceases to be survival and becomes expression. Spirituality ceases to be escape and becomes solid ground. Love ceases to be sacrifice and becomes true partnership. You no longer bend to fit into the world. You shape the world around your presence. The awakened empath becomes selectively generous, offering care where there is reciprocity and distance where there is manipulation. They no longer waste energy on those who don't want to change because they understand that consciousness cannot be forced upon anyone. This clarity is frightening because it means you don't need approval to live. You already are approval itself. Jung said that the self is center and totality, and when you reach this point, you realize you never needed acceptance. You just needed to accept yourself. The ultimate inner revolution is also the quietest. You don't announce it, you become it. Your presence no longer needs explaining, it simply shows. And at this point, people divide: the authentic approach, the toxic flee. You don't need to push anyone. Life itself reorganizes around you. This is where the shadow ceases to be a burden and becomes wisdom. This is where spirituality ceases to be an idealization and becomes a living practice. This is where consciousness ceases to be a search and becomes a state. The awakened empath becomes what Jung feared most, and at the same time, most admired. Someone psychologically whole, impossible to manipulate. You haven't lost your heart. You've gained a backbone. You haven't stopped feeling. You've learned to choose what deserves to be felt. You haven't stopped loving. You've learned to love without betraying yourself. This is the final revolution. It's not about being less sensitive, but about being sensitive with full awareness. And this is the point at which the journey doesn't end, but opens up into new possibilities. Did you notice? It wasn't just a video, it was a cut. And now you have a choice. You will remain anesthetized, serving as a shield for the shadow of others. Or will you use your own shadow as a blade? How many times have you betrayed yourself in the name of a love that wasn't love? How many times have you called fear kindness? How many times have you annulled yourself to fit into a world that only wanted you to be fragile? The wound doesn't close here. It will burn until you decide. And the whole world will feel it when you stop being a puppet. If this tore you up inside, sign up now, because that was just the first cut.